Okay, well, let's take that as our signal to get started. I'll continue to let people in as they show up in our waiting room. But welcome everyone to Core Conversations. This is our second live Q&A for our Core Conversations series. And we're so glad you're here. However you found yourself to the Core Conversation, we're glad you did. My name is Charlie Thomas. I'm a professor of philosophy, director of great books, co-director of the McDonald Center at Mercer University. But more importantly for the moment, I am a member of the board of the Association for Core Texts and Courses, ACTC. ACTC is wonderful association. Most of you here know it, but for those of you who don't, we're committed to using core texts in undergraduate classrooms and promoting required or encouraged interdisciplinary courses in particular that employ those core texts. Our programs, we have a major division is a conference program, and another is an institute program where we work through together on issues of liberal education, pedagogy, curriculum, core texts. It is my pleasure to introduce to you, to say hello, the executive director of ACTC, Kathleen Burke. So Kathleen, would you please unmute yourself for a second and say hello?
Good morning, everyone. I'm really pleased to see you all this lovely morning. I can't wait for the second of our Core Conversations. I wish to take a moment to thank Charlie Thomas for all of her incredible work putting all of this together. I hope that you enjoy the conversations and that you, if you're not already interested and active in ACTC, that you become interested and active in ACTC. We, like everyone, are adapting to the brave new world that we find ourselves in, and we are open to ideas and suggestions and all of your input. So thank you for making time to be with us this morning, and I will turn it back to Charlie. Good morning, Charlie.
Good morning, Kathleen. Thank you very much. Okay, so just one more word about how we're going to do this before I introduce our Q&A leader, our speaker this morning, Professor Josh Parens. This is a Q&A. Professor Parens, I understand, has some remarks to get us started to warm things up. But after that, the session will be driven by your questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, here's how to do it. If you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see an option that says participants. If you click on that, it will bring up a box, and at the bottom of that box will be an option that says raise hand. Click on that. And that creates a queue for me. I can see that you'd like to ask a question, and it also puts your questions in the order that you've indicated your interest in asking them. I will, for the most part, follow the order of that queue, so you can trust that you will likely come up in the order that you raised your hand, but not slavishly. So please don't take it as a personal affront. If someone has already asked a question, is on there for a second time, and I see someone who hasn't yet asked a question, I might move them up. That has nothing to do with whether or not we want your voice in the conversation. It's just a way of getting as many voices in as we can. Also, if you are recognized to ask a question, please turn on your camera. So unmute yourself. If you'd like to leave your camera off while you're listening to the rest of the Q&A, that's fine. But if you're asking a question, please let us see your face. Okay, I think that's it. If you have any questions as we go, just use the chat function and I'll be monitoring that, and I can help. If you'd like to ask a question, you can't figure out how to raise your hand, for example, we'll figure that out. Just send me a chat. Okay. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Joshua Parens. Professor Parens is professor of philosophy and politics at University of Dallas. He is also the dean of the Braniff Graduate School at University of Dallas. And very importantly, for our purposes this morning, Josh is the president of the Association for Core Texts and Courses. So I'm going to hand it over to him now to make a few remarks, and then when he's ready, I'll moderate questions for him. So thanks for doing this, Josh. Really looking forward to this hour together.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Kathleen, and everyone else associated with ACTC. So some of you will have received a bit of an introduction, because I sent the announcement for this out to a list I have of people interested in medieval things, but not everyone would have received my very brief introduction to the discussion. And I think it actually encapsulates things well enough that I'm just going to read that, and then I'm going to give a few more comments past that. So I said in my email to some of you, Averroes offers, in place of discussions of the forms and divided line, among other things, cryptic remarks about the active intellect. He refers to the forms as a Platonic assumption, and in his new Islamic context, the relevant assumption is the active intellect. The appeal to the active intellect places prophecy and law at the center of his revitalization of the Republic. Nothing less than the relation between theoretical knowledge and practical politics are at stake in this foray into Plato's Republic. Now, in the recorded piece that some of you may have heard, I tried to frame this inquiry into Averroes' commentary in the Republic by highlighting how very strange Book 6 of the Republic is. It's strange because more than perhaps any other moment in the Platonic corpus, save perhaps the symposium and the speech of Diotima, Socrates presents the philosopher as if he possesses wisdom. We, of course, have the opposite account in the Apology. Who am I, Socrates? Well, I know that I do not know. That is to say, I have knowledge of ignorance, at least knowledge of ignorance with respect to the divine things. I may know something about the human things, but I'm going to emphasize my ignorance. So we get in the Platonic corpus what amounts to his public defense before the court of Athens, in which he demurs about his knowledge. And then we have the Republic, in which he seems to claim full possession of knowledge, or at least for the purposes of the argument of the Republic, if we're to believe that a philosopher should rule, we would sure hope that he possessed knowledge of all things that would justify the claim that he should rule and no one else should. In the passages that I've given you, and at this moment I'm going to actually just start, I'm going to share my screen. In the second passage, we get this striking argument. This is, again, in Averroes' account of Book 6, of the portion where you would think he would be discussing the forms and the divided line. He includes this rather striking passage in which he talks about what the good is for man. And he notes that according to the law, what the laws existing in this time of ours assert is the following. He concludes in the second paragraph that according to the dialectical theologians, what the good is for man is simply posited by God's will. In the previous paragraph, the first of these two paragraphs, he seems to suggest that most people recognize what the ancient wisdom taught us, which is that there is some natural basis for determinations of what is good, what is bad, what is useful, what is harmful, what is beautiful, and base. So he contrasts what the ancient wisdom tells us with what the dialectical theologians tell us. What the dialectical theologians tell us is that what is good is simply just up to God. The reason I point to this striking passage and why I think Averroes has this in this treatment of the forms and the divided line is that he's trying to suggest that even if we do not have full possession of knowledge with respect to the whole, as Socrates seems to claim, it would appear that Socrates and all philosophers insist on one thing, and that is that in every time and place, there will be a speech like that of the dialectical theologians who say, well, good is just what God says, or if you prefer to go back to the Republic itself, as Thrasymachus said in Book 1, it is simply the convention of one's time. That is to say, what is good, what is bad, is simply a matter of convention. These then are, of course, the two basic arguments that one sees in the history of all thought. A basic opposition between those who claim there is some natural basis for determinations of what is good, bad, useful, harmful, beautiful, and base. And then there appear always to be people who say, no, there is actually no natural basis whatsoever. Why I find Averroes' discussion of this part of the Republic so interesting is that rather than land firmly on the claim that some sort of an argument like the forms gives us final and convincing knowledge about what the natural basis for our determinations of good and bad, useful and harmful, etc. are, he instead concludes somewhat indeterminately with 4 different options about views one could have about the basis for virtue. Now, I am not interpreting this to suggest that he is simply throwing up his hands and saying we can know nothing. Rather, I'm trying to suggest that between the two extremes of the apparent claim of the Republic, the philosopher possesses wisdom, here it is, it's the divided line, or the opposing view, I simply have knowledge of ignorance, I'm trying to suggest that Averroes is pointing to the possibility that what philosophy does is to make consistent and good arguments against those who say the good, the bad, the useful, the harmful. Those are merely what we say or what God says now. I'm trying to suggest that Averroes believes philosophers can and do have powerful arguments against all such pseudo-philosophic or anti-philosophic, or if you prefer, anti-natural arguments. In effect, in every place and time, there will always be someone who will argue that the good has no natural ground whatsoever. Rather than claiming that I, Averroes, or he, Plato, and Socrates, knew the final account of the whole, instead Averroes seems to argue the philosopher's job is to be able to come up with adequate arguments against the opposing position. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I guess I'll stop sharing the screen because it's too confusing for me to continue with the screen up. So have at it.
The queue is open. Emma, please unmute.
Thank you, Josh. It's not an easy story. I really had to listen very carefully, but I really appreciate it, and also because I try to teach a little bit of Averroes, but again, it's not easy, and it's good to hear the expert on it. I have a little bit of a clarifying question, because it seems that Averroes seems to, in your reading, seems to juxtaposition nature, not just with, well, I don't know, I guess the sort of nihilism of Thrasymachus, but also with meta-nature, if I can call it that, with the forms. Because you seem to say that, well, some of these dialectical theologians, for example, in a way are maybe too Platonic in the sense that they postulate God's will as something now I'm actually mixing things up. But maybe if I can backtrack a little bit, is not Averroes downplaying Plato's understanding that we participate in the good?
If you mean by referring to the active intellect rather than the forms, he's somehow downplaying participation in the good. I don't think that that's quite what he's after, or what I was trying to suggest he was saying. What I was trying to suggest that he was saying was that by referring to the forms as Plato's assumption and slotting in immediately after that the active intellect, the argument seems to be that the active intellect is playing the role in our new Islamic setting that the forms played in his. Now, to support that, Averroes omits not only an account of the forms in the divided line, but as it happens, he omits Book 10 as well, which is to say the account of the immortality of the soul. He says he omits it because it suggests that one ought to be virtuous in order to achieve immortality as a reward. And, we don't want to do that because that would turn virtue into a means to something else, which of course we all know that's one of the reasons that was held in reserve. But anyway, my point is that I find it amazingly striking that Averroes would treat the active intellect as playing the equivalent role to the forms. Most of us in studying Plato have been led to believe that the forms are somehow the central theoretical claim of Socrates. Is he really suggesting that as Averroes, that the active intellect has comparable centrality? So I tried to piece together what justification he might have for that. And what I started to realize was not only is there this common thread with respect to immortality, but the argument that he makes about the philosopher king, if I might actually just temporarily share my screen and go back to the first passage. So in this first passage, he's talking about the suggestion that the philosopher should be king because he possesses all of these virtues and forms of science. And since he's philosopher and king, that also ultimately means that he's the lawgiver. He then goes on to say, well, let's determine whether he should also be prophet. It turns out that he can't say that it's necessary that he be prophet, but it's at least clear that it would be preferable that he should be prophet. What then has just happened? The active intellect ends up being the very core of the teaching about the philosopher king, because the philosopher king is now the lawgiver. And if he's to be the lawgiver, he must be able to receive the law as revelation to his intellect, as the philosophers have argued. So it turns out that the active intellect plays this absolutely central role because of the way in which Averroes is expanding the conception of the philosopher king to encompass the lawgiver. The key mistake that we must not make, that the dialectical theologians make, is to think that to say the philosopher king is the prophet, is to suggest that God simply drops revelation into his mind without the mediation of the mind of the philosopher. On the contrary, God must pass this through the active intellect, and then it is given to our intellect, which is to say, the law is not simply the posit of God. To try to reframe the whole argument in more familiar terms from the Euthyphro, the real opposition is between the claim, well, there is a natural basis for things like piety and justice, namely the forms. Remember, the alternative to that was that it was simply what the gods posited. This is exactly the same thing that's playing out here. What Averroes is suggesting is that the dialectical theologians lead us to believe something like what Euthyphro believed, which was the God just drops it in my head, and that's how I know it. On the contrary, what Averroes is suggesting is the law has a natural ground. The active intellect is simply the metaphor that I use to describe or to make this claim that the good and the bad, the useful and the harmful, have a natural basis. So anyway, I'm going to stop sharing and try to stop haranguing or going on so long. So
that was, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I can recognize the next person if you're ready.
I am.
Okay, Rick, you're next, and then Alex, you're after that.
Josh, actually, your very recent remarks in part answered the question that I had, or at least addressed the question that I had, but also left me with some other related questions. And because I was going to mention the Euthyphro as well. If I'm not mistaken, when you initially explained Averroes' view, you said that the good is posited by God. And so my initial question is what the word posit meant here. Is posit, something like divine command theory?
So if I said that in connection with the dialectical theologians,
Okay.
So it was the dialectical theologians whom he is opposing,
I see,
who claimed this. And I'm sorry that I had too many balls in the air there at certain points, but the basic opposition is between the pseudo-philosophy of the dialectical theologians who claim the good is simply whatever God posits.
Okay. And Averroes is opposing that.
He is opposing that.
Okay, that's very helpful.
Right.
I wasn't entirely clear. Then your last remarks suggested that, and then I was just wondering how to put it all together. Related to this, though, you're talking. You made some references to a natural basis for the good, and I'm wondering whether that natural basis is to be thought of as I don't know, something akin perhaps to the forms, but distinct from the simply the positing of God, or whether it's natural in the more modern sense, really, of something that is fitting, or even for the Aristotelian sense of something that is fitting, given what human beings are. Aquinas, says that God commands nothing that isn't good for man. And so I'm trying to place Averroes in connection with your remark that there is a natural basis for the good.
Okay. So my use of that phrase is just as a substitute for claiming the forms are an assumption for Socrates and the active intellect is our assumption. Those two assumptions are tantamount to the claim the good has a natural basis. What is most striking in the case of Averroes is that he doesn't seem to attempt to say, I've got a final account of the active intellect to which I can appeal and say, this is what the active intellect is, and this is the natural basis. Instead, he concludes his remarks that are a substitute for the discussion of the forms in the divided line with four possibilities about the eternality of intelligible things. And mixed in there with those four options are the possibility that will somehow determines what the intelligible things are. That's actually a kind of bow to the dialectical theologian saying, I haven't yet proven to you that the active intellect exists in the way that the form is thought to exist, the forms are thought to exist. What I'm trying to suggest is Averroes seems to be adopting a far more reserved position than Socrates himself seems to present in the divided line. As we walk away from the divided line, we feel a bit mystified, but we also feel satisfied because we think the philosopher is outside of the cave looking at the sun.
Right.
Not shying from the sun as we were told to do in the Phaedo, but actually just out there looking right at it, not being blinded. That is a really hyperbolic account of what the philosopher is. And all that I'm trying to suggest is that Averroes is adopting a more moderate view. And the more moderate view is Socrates is correct about the forms in the following way. It would appear that all human beings divine something about what the good, the beautiful, and the just are. That divination is of something natural, not of something revealed, but of something natural. We all divine it. Philosophers may come up with arguments to prove to us this is what those are. But I think what Averroes is suggesting is that perhaps no philosopher ever has or ever will give us a fully adequate account of the natural basis of these claims.
Okay, I have some additional questions, but I'm going to defer because I'm sure other people want to participate in this very interesting conversation.
Thanks, Rick. Alex, please unmute yourself. You're next.
Hi. Thanks, Josh, for all this. This is really interesting. I guess I'll just pick up where Richard left off. Why is he being so reserved? I mean, I can see how perhaps if he spells it out a little too much, he'd have to start talking about maybe if it's not done by fiat, then it has to be in nature. It seems like the universe is eternal or something like that. That can get him into maybe some. But I mean, he wrote a huge book defending far more dogmatic claims, right, than this more reserved. So why here is he showing this reserve that maybe we could call a little uncharacteristic, at least on certain issues that might upset theologians? Obviously, he shows reserve elsewhere, but it seems like he says much more bold things when he's responding to Ghazali, for example.
I think the brief answer is that he can be more frank in this work about the nature of philosophy than he can be in a work in which he's expected to fully elaborate the doctrine. The question is, what is the status of that doctrine when seen from the point of view of the whole of his thought? And I suspect actually we're closer to getting a sense for where he sees such accounts that he gives in other works. Those other works are, in other words, presenting a more doctrinaire account that is intended to supplant that of the dialectical theologians. Here he's being more frank, interestingly, when giving an account of one of the most hyperbolic moments in Plato. So it's an interesting choice of timing, but I think it makes sense mainly because what's in play here is the relation between the theoretical and the practical, which I would argue is actually the highest inquiry in philosophy. The highest inquiry is not theory alone, but the relation between them.
So he's, just to clarify, he's being reserved about dogma, but in a way more explicit about his Socratic leanings.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thomas Cleveland, you're up. Please unmute yourself.
Hello, thank you. I'm trying to find a way to frame this somewhat broad question as directly as I can. My understanding of your argument is that Averroes does not assert that he or anyone else has complete knowledge of nature. But what is in question is whether it's reasonable to argue or to investigate on the assumption that there is something like nature, as opposed to the view of the world that the Mujikalimun assert exists, where there is no nature. And I understand that that sort of structure of the problem as you presented. I guess I just wanted you to say a little bit more about how Averroes thinks you can go about establishing that there is something like nature. I could see you've said something in the direction of people seem to have opinions about the noble and the just and the good, assuming that there is some such thing, but that itself is just a beginning point, I would assume. So if you could say more about that, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. So keeping in mind that the second treatise is his account of books 6 and 7, and he substitutes for the account of the forms in the divided line an inquiry into what should rule. And the inquiry into what should rule is made on the basis of what is naturally highest. And so he engages in a dialectical discussion of the various claims to rule of the various aspects of the soul that he says the philosopher needs to possess in its fullest form. So the whole investigation ends up being an involved inquiry into what has the right to lord it over others, right? Where the key word is that word Lord, which, given that this is a Hebrew translation of a work that no longer exists in Arabic, is a pretty important word. As any of you who know, Adonai is that which takes the place of God's name. So he keeps on again and again and again. This Hebrew translation suggests that is the key means by which one discovers that there is a natural order, because one can actually explore the parts of the soul and see the ways in which one part serves another.
Can I have just one follow-up? Does the psychology presented there not itself depend on the assumption that there's something like nature, or it's a pre-philosophic or pre-scientific psychology? If what's to be done is to establish nature and you're using an Aristotelian or some other psychology that presumes there's nature, is that a problem, or is that, how do you?
No, he starts from generally accepted opinions about the soul. Not to say that he doesn't import scientific distinctions, but he does at key moments. He uses opinion as a place to start from. But I'm not convinced that there is a moment in Plato or in Aristotle in which one is given somehow magical warrant for saying, now we can turn to the natural. Because, of course, what characterizes these philosophers is a certain kind of faith that in the possibility of an ascent from opinion to knowledge. By the way, a kind of faith that we don't have in any way in modern, from the moment of the beginning of modern philosophy, that trust in the possibility of ascent from opinion no longer exists. And for that very reason, we tend not to believe in the possibility of that ascent, but I think actually Averroes does. But.
Thank you.
John Holt, please unmute yourself next.
Hi, thanks for allowing me to be part of this conversation. I belonged to ACTC years ago, and then I dropped out after I retired. Anyway, my question has to do with the nature of authority. Averroes is coming from the Islamic tradition where the supreme authority is the Quran. The Quran as dictated to Muhammad, and they go to great lengths to suggest that Muhammad couldn't have made this up because he was illiterate and got it in a cave and blah, blah, blah. So it came directly from God, from Allah. And the philosophers don't have that access. You take the authority from Muhammad. Now, why did they take the authority from Muhammad? That's a good question. But it seems to me, in part, a political question. That is to say, Muhammad represented a way to consolidate power. Historically, at the time, the various tribes in Arabia were plundering each other, and there were all kinds of problems and so on, whereas Muhammad comes along with an idea of unity they could all get behind and so on. So the Quran becomes the authority, and the philosopher, his job is to explain the Quran, to go into detail about what it's all about. And Averroes seems to be making the argument that the Quran has to be interpreted so that we can understand what Muhammad was saying, or God was saying through Muhammad. And those interpretations require dialectical investigation. So I think he's making a case that authority, from one point of view, can come from a central point. That is an authoritative text coming presumably from God, or authority can come through a process of the active intellect engaging with other active intellects, and that authority comes from a kind of a consensus. So that's my interpretation, or my understanding of what Averroes is trying to get at, that the philosopher's job is to talk with other philosophers and come to a consensus to have a basis of authority for moving forward in human political existence.
Okay. John, I guess you voiced two different accounts. One that underscores a certain kind of literalism about the text, and that it was received by an illiterate prophet on the one hand, and on the other hand, that the text requires interpretation, and interpretation of that is agreed upon through consensus. Mm-hmm. The reference to agreed upon through consensus, I think, is a reference to the way in which the ulama, or the learned, were thought to arrive at consensus about what the text means. The main problem I would raise is that Averroes doesn't assent simply to the consensus of a majority of the learned. Mm-hmm. He wants actually to bring philosophic reasoning to bear on the text in interpreting it, within very tightly constrained limits. He's not trying to suggest that everything in the text is open to interpretation. But all I would suggest is that the philosophical position might not depend upon consensus, even though what I have been suggesting is that philosophers give their different doctrines. That may have led you to the suggestion that I was trying to argue that philosophers inquire into things and arrive at consensus, but I don't know that that's important from Averroes' point of view. All I meant to suggest was that it may be that philosophers agree that in different times there might be a more fitting doctrine than at other times. There isn't simply one doctrine that will work in every period, place, and time. Anyway.
Good, thanks.
Yeah.
The queue is open, and so I'm going to jump in. I was really struck, Josh, by this claim you made a few minutes ago, which seems to follow very clearly on some of the other things that you've said. That the highest philosophical activity is not pure theory, but relating theory to practice. And this seems to me to be, at the heart of what you're talking about here. And it makes me want to ask you about the images some of which you've already mentioned, but one of which you haven't yet, because book 6 begins with the ship of state, ends with a divided line, and then of course book 7 begins with the cave, which you've already mentioned. And so I completely agree that this moment where the philosopher looks at the sun is odd and hyperbolic. But of course, I mean, the cave image is an image in motion, and that's it's a perhaps, I mean, of course it's also not entirely specified, but possibly a brief moment, maybe one that is painful and remarkably brief, but that the one who has that moment is compelled to go back down and then come back up again, and it's only after that second ascent that they're qualified to be among those considered as a philosopher king. And so we see this way in which the active intellect, the apprehension of the good, is a part of this process, and not a moment. It is a moment that we can isolate, but in the context of how it's presented, it seems to me to be a mistake to isolate it. It's a part of this up, out of the cave, back down, back up again motion. It's an extremely important moment, but still it's a part of that process. And it seems to me in that way we can connect it really clearly to the image of the ship of state, and which I read as a kind of a question. Can the stargazer be the true pilot? That is, can the one who apprehends, sees the course in the stars, also be the one who can be befriended by the ship owner and take the sailors in hand? And so I just wonder if you speak to the images and the way that maybe they might mitigate against book 6 really, except in that way being a complete outlier, or that hyperbole being inexplicable in some way.
Oh, sure. No, that's a very helpful comment. And an important one to keep in mind from Averroes that would be a response to it is he claims at the beginning to leave out book 1, right? So he leaves out book 1, book 10, forms and divided line. Those are the key things he omits. He justifies the omission of book 1 because it's such a dialectical book, which then suggests that he is going to present the rest of the Republic as arriving at scientific conclusions. That's, of course, not the way in which we typically tend to read the Republic. So the claim that I've been trying to make about the hyperbole is really just in keeping with this particular way of looking at the Republic, which tends to abstract from the drama of the work. So I am the first person to acknowledge that, or the last person to deny that the Republic is not, it doesn't leave us finally with the view that the philosopher possesses wisdom. But it does at least try to impress upon Glaucon something of that sense, such that Glaucon might defer to Socrates, defer to the philosopher's right to rule, and therefore himself withdraw from his aspiration to rule.
Thank you. Thomas Cleveland, please unmute yourself. You're next.
I wanted to get some clarity on this last text you provided. Right, you can bring it up. There's a question about what the status of the theoretical sciences are, and you've divided into 4 options. Am I correct first in saying that the first 2 assume that the theoretical sciences are everlasting, and the latter 2 assume that it is not everlasting? So my question is a very simple one. What's the significance of it being one way or the other? In the earlier paragraph, the question is posed as whether there's something beyond the theoretical sciences that's higher or more noble, more divine. What's the text? More noble. Another rank.
That is again because we're trying to arrive at that which has the right to rule, and so he's trying to determine whether we've reached the very top.
Right. Okay.
Right, and whether these have the right to rule.
Right. So then I would assume the thing that's higher, that's of a higher rank or creation. In the context there, it could be the practical sciences, but it could also be some divine revelation, I would assume. But I guess, or no.
Well, so again, the problem is that it's the preceding section in which he's gone through everything, including the practical sciences as options, and he's arrived at through process of elimination at theoretical science is that which would seem to have the right to lord it over others. But yes, this question about whether the theoretical sciences are everlasting, I think it encapsulates the problem posed by both forms and active intellect. If you look at that first option, he's really giving you a kind of thumbnail sketch of the so-called theory of recollection.
Yeah.
Right. As for him who assumes that theoretical sciences are everlasting and that they exist in us in actuality, and that the humors have only submerged them since youth, why in this manner they are as if they stood still in potential. Either they are, and so then we get separate forms, or it is the active intellect. That is, either the separate forms or the active intellect confirms that the theoretical sciences are everlasting. If either of those assumptions is incorrect, then it may well be the case that the theoretical sciences are not everlasting. And so, go ahead.
I'm just saying, in everlasting in this context, what's the simple meaning there? That is everlasting just a term of praise, or does it mean they have existed for all time?
I think it's evident when one goes to the next sentence. It is evident that if this is assumed, human perfection is not itself acquired through the will. He seems to be suggesting that science could merely be man's construction, or not. right? That really does underline how amazingly radical a passage this is, vis-a-vis some of his other works in which he seems to be, proving the existence of the active intellect, et cetera, et cetera. It's a shockingly open sort of account of these things.
But does that mean, this is the thing I was thinking, was he still allowing that the theoretical science ought to rule, even if they are in a way the creation of man, or they're merely coeval with this human species, but not?
Yeah, I think only if the former is the case would theoretical science have anything like the right to rule. And part of the difficulty then is, if theoretical science does not in fact possess wisdom, there is a sense in which the claim of philosopher kingship is, well, as problematic as we all know it is. In other words, if it is the case that we do not in fact possess wisdom, the claim of the philosopher to the right to lord it over others is a problem, questionable.
But
Thomas, we have one more person on the queue, so I'm gonna ask that John Holt unmute and that we move on, because we only have about 8 minutes left.
Okay, thanks for having me again. I've been wondering for years now why it doesn't seem to be emphasized that the Republic is a grand analogy between the human soul and the polity, or the polis, and that the whole reason for the discussion in books 2 through 10 of the polis is to understand the human soul. So really, his discussion of the polis, the ideal polis, is simply a very detailed way of getting at the nature of the tripart human soul, the tripart soul that is described beautifully in the where you have a charioteer, a white horse, and a black horse, and a white horse.
Got a problematic connection.
Is thumos, the will with courage, and that the charioteer is reason. Reason is not wisdom, is not Sophia. Reason is logos, and that it never attained to the kind of understanding. I'm just wondering about the relevance of the notion of the Republic as a grand analogy to what Averroes is saying about the philosopher and the philosopher king.
Yeah, well, it seems to me actually the analogy of city and soul is actually pretty widely acknowledged as central. I'm not sure that it is accurate to say that the Republic is really for knowing the soul rather than for knowing the city. After all, at least the argument is that we're looking at the soul in order to understand the city.
I think it's vice versa.
Well, I'll at least put it this way. What we're told is that the account that we're given is the short road, and the long road is much longer. And we are not given that. So we're given an extremely abbreviated account. Some have suggested reasonably that perhaps the entire Platonic corpus is something like that longer road of an inquiry into the soul. Be that as it may, I'm not sure that I have a whole lot of additional light to shed on that based on Averroes. So.
Okay.
Perhaps with 4 minutes left to go. We have one quick question from Rodolfo Hernandez, but we do only have about 4 minutes to go, so please keep that in mind.
Hi, I was wondering about the picture of the philosopher in his relation to the city in the Averroes account now. I mean, I guess the way I thought you laid it out is that you got the sense from the cave and the divided line that the philosopher is a knower, or at least he's always worried about attempting to know. But now maybe he's more of a defender of nature. It's maybe a more social role, more political role. He's the guy that opposes divine will theory and conventionalism.
Okay.
So is that moving away from the philosopher as knower or sort of solitary, isolated person?
Look, all that I was trying to challenge is the widely accepted view that philosophy is tantamount to giving a final theoretical account of the whole. I just have my doubts that ultimately proves to be the primary task of philosophy, mainly because of the limits of our ability to provide it. So that is why I end up trying to make the suggestion that it may be this humbler role of mounting arguments against those who would say there is no natural basis whatsoever for the good, the bad, the useful, the harmful, etc.
I think with 1 minute to go, we should probably thank Professor Parens for this wonderful Q&A. Those of you who have not yet watched the Professor Parens' recorded remarks, they're available on the ACTC webpage. And anyone who's interested in more information about ACTC, please let us know. I'd be happy to answer questions, but so would our president, Professor Parens, and Kathleen Burke, who spoke to us a minute ago, the executive director of the association. We have another core conversation coming up. Already the recorded half of my conversation with Paige Laws about Margaret Walker's poem For My People is on the ACTC webpage, and her live Q&A will be November 13th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. So we hope you will join us then and tell your friends. And thank you again, Josh, for this wonderful hour of conversation.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, everybody. See you soon. Goodbye.